Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Kingdom Outpost Goes Off Script. Today we are joined by a guest, Dr. Alexandre Christoyannopoulos, who wrote the book Christian Anarchism, Political Commentary on the Gospels. Is that right?
Yeah.
And also Derek from the Fourth Way.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Derek Kreider, like Rebecca said, from the Fourth Way podcast, which I started because I was just trying to kind of get my thoughts out on nonviolence and kind of organize them and put them in place so I could go back when I needed to refresh my memory. And I found myself as I went through pacifism that it inevitably led me towards the ideas of Christian anarchism. The two seemed kind of intertwined and inevitable. So I was really excited when Rebecca asked me to come on today for this interview. I'm looking forward to it.
Great. And Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Alex Christoyannopoulos. I don't know what you want me to say at this stage. I'm a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at Loughborough University. That's the other thing people aren't sure how to pronounce, Loughborough, here in the UK. And yeah, I did write that book, which was the outcome of the PhD several years ago. I think bouncing off what Derek just said, I'm more and more interested in questions of sort of non-violence and pacifism, but not necessarily rooted in religion. So these days I do a lot of research around pacifism and non-violence. I'm launching a journal on that, which is very much open to sort of contributions that are embedded in religious studies, theology and whatnot, but not necessarily either. But we might come to this in a minute. I don't know.
Cool. And you have a recent book about Tolstoy's?
Yes. That's the other, so I've got it here, that's the other thing that took a while to produce. When I started my research on what would become the PhD on Christian anarchism, actually I aimed first to do something on Tolstoy and Tolstoy's political thought. Now, for a range of reasons, the PhD morphed away from that and towards kind of a study of Christian anarchism more generally, although it's really more an exegesis of Christian anarchism, or even not even that. It's kind of bringing together the bits of exegesis of Christian anarchism that lots of different people have written and trying to present them as coherent a whole as I could. But sorry, I'm getting fired up now. But so at the time, I was particularly interested in Tolstoy, and after the PhD, it took me too long because of all sorts of reasons, but I finally did kind of return to the material I had started on and eventually wrote the book on Tolstoy's political thought because there is still no book that addresses it the way I wanted to anyway in English. And so yes, maybe to prefigure a question you might ask me, I don't know, because I tend to be asked that, but it's kind of through Tolstoy that I got to Christian anarchism, and therefore, or not, I don't know about therefore, but after the Christian anarchism material, I've returned to Tolstoy, at least for a bit. But yes.
Yes, I particularly appreciated the book on Christian anarchism because it was a synthesis. Like, you have Tolstoy, you have Ellul, Jacques Ellul, and then you have these bits and pieces, but no one had yet before that, I think, actually created a coherent sort of synthesis of Christian anarchism as an idea across these various authors.
I mean, that was my impression, yes. I guess, I don't know if it's to come clean, but to confess, I mean, I'm not someone who had much of a religious education to begin with prior to the PhD. I got interested in religion and politics for a range of reasons when I did, and coming at it as someone who already was interested in questions of non-violence and pacifism, I got intrigued. There's a sort of anecdotal story to it, but I'll skip those details. But I guess basically got intrigued by the idea that Jesus could be treated as a political theorist or as a political philosopher or something like that. And when I was quoted, passages of the gospel, which most of which I had heard, but I wasn't particularly, versed in it at the time, I thought, okay, this is really interesting because if it is political, then it's rather pacifist, and if you take it to what would seem to be its coherent logic, or all the way, not to the extreme, but to the conclusion of it, then you'd probably reach an anarchist conclusion to the extent that the state is a violent actor and so on. And that's around then, I don't know, I can't remember exactly when Tolstoy was mentioned to me, or if at which point that ingredient came in. But that's when I stumbled on Tolstoy, who of course is someone who does exactly that. He, argues on some sort of awkward Christian foundation that Christianity amounts to, or should amount to, pacifism or a rejection of violence, and on that basis also rejection of the state. But Tolstoy is also frustrating because there are a few issues which he kind of ignores, which if you want to be consistent, you ought to at least address. So Romans 13, render unto Caesar, several other things he just isn't very good at. He tends to ignore or dismiss a bit too quickly. And of course he has this very rationalistic understanding of Christianity, which most Christians don't necessarily relate to. So he's almost kind of a hindrance to his own message, for some audiences anyway. And at that point, I realized there were many more. There's Ellul, Eller, Dave Andrews, the Catholic Workers, and plenty more. And reading them in closer detail, I realized actually these voices complement each other quite well, because where one is stronger but weaker on other things, another might be stronger on those weaker sides. And so the PhD became, I think as I put it in there, kind of weaving together the loose threads of Christian anarchist exegesis. And I should have stressed that it's really, I think, largely an exegetical endeavor in the book, together to present as coherent as possible an exegesis of Christian anarchism, basically. So yes, Tolstoy's really, he writes really well. He's really exciting, and exciting is the wrong word, interesting and provocative, and I think he moves you in a number of ways. But he's also got his problems, and I think these other voices help complement the Christian anarchist thesis a bit more.
So one of the questions that I put down is, what would you say would define Christian anarchism uniquely from other political theologies?
I guess one thing is the kind of unequivocal critique of violence and rejection of violence. It's not that it's the only theology that does that, and of course there's pacifist theology for that matter, but it's so unequivocal that it also dares to question the violence that we take for granted as apparently agreeable and consented to by everyone, which is the violence of the state. Or should I rephrase, the violence that human beings inflict on one another through the state, or in the name of a particular fear out of which we empower the state to inflict that violence. And that's violence which is both direct, if you've been to a demonstration, you would have seen how things can get heated up and become genuinely violent, in terms of police repression. We could go all the way to kind of, prison and so on. But there's a structural violence as well, and the policing of a status quo that is unjust through the violence of the state and the threat of violence. Now, I think that commitment to a rejection of violence, I'm not saying non-violence, I think that follows, but a commitment to rejecting violence is something that most Christian anarchists hold to dearly. There are exceptions, but yes. As a result of that, a willingness and openness to critique the state and the options of working through it to try and ameliorate social conditions, that's kind of rejected. And I think there is also, maybe I don't play that up enough in the book, but I think it is a consistent theme through many Christian anarchist voices. It's a critique of idolatry. So a critique of, I suppose, human politics as a form of idolatry, and of the state as a form of idolatry. And Ellul goes into that, and several others. Eller as well. It's not a big thing for Tolstoy, for example, but I think it is an important theme in the Christian anarchist voices I've come across, and I've come across through many more actually since the book. So yes, I think those would be the core things. Now, none of these things are necessarily only the purview of Christian anarchists, but I think they're big for Christian anarchists. They're important, and they kind of define it as a particular strand of maybe a form of liberation theology.
So you would categorize it as a variant of liberation theology?
Classifications. Us academics can spend endless time, debating classifications. I don't know. I don't want to force a particular classification on things. I think it's kind of up to people how they want to use terms to some extent. But I think there's a logic to it. So if I go through it the slightly longer route in sort of secular anarchism, socialism, Marxism, left-leaning thinking and ideologies, you know, there's a strong view out there, it's not the only one, but that you could treat anarchism as a form of socialism broadly defined, although others will say socialism is a kind of moderate version of precisely what we reject, we're more radical, we're anarchists, whatever. But, you know, many of the traits that anarchists classically understood, so excluding anarcho-capitalists, which we might come to later on, are basically very similar to socialism, just with that commitment to question the state and other hierarchies of domination, I suppose, a bit further than socialists might be willing to. So if you accept that argument for kind of secular ideologies, or secular anarchism, secular socialism, then I don't think it's that big of a leap to make a similar argument about theologies of liberation and Christian anarchism. As in, of course, liberation theology is originally a particular movement that grows out of a particular context, Latin America, but it's since then adopted all around the world in all sorts of different kind of contexts and articulated in slightly different way as a slightly different theology of liberation, using the term loosely. Now, I think it's not incoherent to argue that Christian anarchists are seeking some sort of liberation, emancipation from, well, again, there is definitely the kind of the political economy of today, so that would be the sort of Marxist analysis that liberation theology might sympathize with, but they'll take that all the way to the state as well, and so it's in a sense a theology, certainly an exegesis, to the extent that I've looked at it, of liberation of some kind. But you know, I'm willing to concede that that's not the only way you can skin that cat, and you could possibly, that's horrible expression, but it's, you know, you can argue that. Liberation theology is a tradition of its own, and I don't think many Christian anarchists that have published the stuff that I've read. I'm not talking about people active today, more generally the broader movement, but I don't think many of these kind of published Christian anarchists would necessarily associate themselves with liberation theology. But that's also because many of these voices emerged prior to liberation theology, so it's debatable. But I think you can make a case for, you know, treating it as part of that broadly defined, I think.
Interesting, because I've read critiques like Hebden would like strongly be like, no, it is not liberation theology. Liberation theology is like causing dependence on the state. But anyway,
but that would be a disagreement precisely on that. In the same way that anarchists might push back against socialism by saying precisely that we don't go through the state. Keith is a friend, Keith Hebden. But yes, no, fair enough. I think that's a valid argument as well. I think the point about this is to sort of, you know, in the kind of landscape of what do we want to call them? Do we want to call them ideologies for the minute? In the landscape of political ideologies, you know, there are kind of clusters and families, and certainly liberation theology and Christian anarchism aren't too far apart. Although what divides what we typically understand as theology of liberation and what you might want to see as Christian anarchism is an important point of difference, and it would be this issue of the state. So yeah, not my job to police those uses of term as much as to notice the interesting kind of overlaps and tensions.
Yeah, it's interesting debate. Derek, do you have a question?
I just wanted to make an observation about one of the things that you said that kind of clicked for me. I don't know what politics is like where you guys are, but in the States, it's insane at this point in particular. And, you know, when you said that, talked about idolatry and said that people are able to be critical of the state, I can hear people on both sides of the aisle in the state saying, well, you know, I'm critical of the state. I'm critical of vaccine mandates, or I'm critical of non-vaccine, you know, or non-vaxxers. But what I was thinking is, I feel like after reading your book and kind of wrestling with anarchism, I feel like for the first time I'm able to be critical of the state as a whole, whereas when people say they're critical of the state, they're critical of the other idol, the other person's idol, and they defend their own idol. They're not really critical of the state. And I think that's something that is clearer to me now, that a lot of people can't see it when they're inside the system.
So that's interesting, and I think it touches on a range of different things. I don't know if politics is as mad here as it is where you are. We've heard, we hear you. We pay attention. Your politics matters. It's interesting because yes, I think you're right. I can hear those similar voices outside the US as well. People criticizing the state, but coming from I suppose a left-leaning perspective. What they criticize will be a state that polices and forces maintains a status quo that is basically, running a political economy that's in the favor of a limited range of people against a broader, against everyone else. It's a state that's increasingly militarized. It's a state that does inflict violence. It's a state that's kind of adventuristic in its foreign policy, and it's not necessarily just the US. It might be the UK, might be others too. So that kind of state is what you often see criticized on the left, I suppose. And I guess that the state that voices on the right, on I guess the anarcho-capitalist, if that's a term, kind of position would criticize, would be the state that they immediately think is somehow necessarily Stalinist and overly interventionist, imposing inequality, somehow stifling human creativity and endeavor. I mean, I have deep issues with that analysis. I think it's faulty on a range of reasons. But to stick to your comment or question, that's a different state that's being criticized. I hear you. I think that's an interesting observation. But I think to try and push it a bit further, and again, that's something I didn't do enough, I think, in the PhD and in the book, but it's kind of, I suppose, matured over time in my mind, and will continue to do so. No doubt I'll think back at what I just said now and think that was still immature in some way. It's not just the state, I think, and this is where it gets complicated. A lot of anarchists will say that anarchism is fundamentally about kind of critiquing, rejecting the state. But a lot of other anarchists will say it's really not just that. It's kind of broader hierarchies of domination and oppression. So the state, but also capitalism, racism, and the various structures that maintain it and police it. And actually a whole range of things can come in. Gender and all that, if you want to go into it. I mean, there's all sorts of hierarchies and preferences that end up favoring particular demographics over others. And I think it's probably fairer to describe anarchism, this is debatable, why am I doing this? But it's probably fairer to describe anarchism as a position that is critical of hierarchies of domination. It's a position of non-domination. Some of my colleagues have argued this. So it's not just the state, you see, and that's important because a lot of the Christian anarchists, and Tolstoy for that matter, really is focused primarily on the state. And you do have anarchists who are focused on the state. But many other anarchists, Christian included, will go deeper. And it's not just the state, it's kind of the broader status quo that is maintained and policed and enforced by the state, because the state does have a role. So it's not that they let the state off the hook, but they go deeper, not just the state, if you see what I'm saying. And you see, the thing then is, I'm wondering how that then, with that in mind, you go back to what we were saying earlier about kind of left-wing and right-wing positions about the state. Like, I think the kind of left-wing critique of the state is very amenable to that kind of analysis and broadening, because you can kind of weave into this kind of some of these broader struggles against various forms of domination today. The right-wing critique, I think, is a bit harder, because what's basically disliked is intervention in property and things like that, when property is precisely easily a deep hierarchy that's being meant, like, fine to own a few things, fine to own the products of your labor. When you own acres of land next to a village that's basically deprived of any of it to survive, that's a bigger issue. And that's fundamentally the understanding of private property that is being maintained and protected today, and which the right-wing criticisms of the state don't address. They just don't like intervention into that. I'm simplifying a bit. Sorry, I got interested. Good question.
Actually, that's something I've been interested in my research. The more I dug into Anabaptism and Christian anarchism, it seemed like there is a shift now, or at least a gap in the research, going away from focusing on high politics and the maintenance of the state to what is like empire in human relationships, in situated interactions, like post-anarchism.
Yeah, and there are others. Look, most of the anarchists I've met this side of the pond, therefore, are at least as often, if not more, critical of, you might call it capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, and the various imperialistic adventures that it tends to ride on, justify, facilitate, and therefore empire, broadly speaking. I mean, that's a term, yes, coming from Hart and Negri. These aren't anarchists, but it's kind of vocabulary and an analysis that's easily, I suppose, importable into an anarchist analysis. I mean, those are the things that exercise them, and how much at the end of that analysis you still conclude that it's the state that's the main enemy, I think depends from one voice to the next. But generally, the state becomes one of several players, an important one again, because it's the backer of it all. Like, it ultimately, to date, it's still, you know, the police that's going to come and enforce these kind of relations and what's backed up by the law, or the military, rather than private companies, at least as yet. Or even if there are private, I suppose, mercenaries, they're usually legitimized by the legal order, and again, there's a backup by the state. So it gets complicated. But I think that for me is when it becomes even more interesting. Look, a lot of what academic analysis, or actually fair or nuanced or in-depth analysis of most things, involves complicating a picture. It's usually things are more complicated than you think, and actually I do think that most anarchists I've read, you know, complicate the critique beyond what, as we've said, just kind of the state, to a number of different phenomena. And in today's context, in today's globalized political economy, 2021, and for a while already, actually, it's to do with, some people will call it neoliberal capitalism. And that's often what they'll rail against before they come to an analysis of the state, even though that's important too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you'll know that. Going to something that Derek mentioned, and also a question that I had with, what would be some of the possible contributions of Christian anarchism today, especially with regards to the Christian political climate, which the most vocal one I would see would be, you know, the North American Christian political climate, and just the past few years, something like that. Like, what could Christian anarchism contribute to discourses in Christianity today about politics?
No, that's a good question. And look, this is again where I need to, I suppose, complete. First of all, I'm not in the North American context. I'm in a context where religiosity, to use that term, isn't as embedded, widespread as it is in North America. And I'm not, a church-going Christian. I'm not sure I am a Christian, if I'm going to be really honest. It depends how you define it. I mean, some people, when I say that, tell me, no, you are. We can go into that if you want to. I come at this, as might be obvious by now, from a Tolstoyan perspective primarily, perhaps. Like, it's the morality that I'm interested in, and the import of that in politics. Now, therefore, if I do kind of wear a Tolstoyan cap and look at kind of American politics today, or American religion and politics, well, let's not mince words. As far as Tolstoy is concerned, most people who call themselves Christians in the US are not Christians. They're simply not adhering by the pretty radical morality that Jesus keeps talking about again and again, returning to in both his teaching and in his example throughout the gospel. And that's even the variant that survived us through the various councils that polished Christianity for the empire back, in the 300s. So, with that in mind, actually, before I do that, to those who will counter-argue that a Tolstoyan kind of Christianity is not Christianity anymore, because Tolstoy did indeed reject the miracles, the resurrection, most things theological. He's just focusing on the morality of Jesus, as it were. That's what matters to him. To those who say that, I will gladly concede that that is true. Tolstoy has a rather biased understanding. What he focuses on is just the morality rather than the metaphysics. However, I'd also welcome, let's just put it this way, I'd invite those critics to reflect on whether they are underplaying the morality as much as Tolstoy is underplaying the metaphysics, and perhaps in the process, therefore, kind of ditching what Christianity is supposed to be about. Look, most non-Christians will tell you that the one main thing that defines Christianity is this turn the other cheek. That's kind of the radical message of Jesus, this commitment to love and to forgiveness, which goes beyond most other religious traditions in the radicality of his preaching. Well, where is it? I don't see it in a lot of the voters for Trump, to go straight for that word. This is the demographic that by and large voted him in. It represents a rather passionate corner of a very passionate and strained political canvas in the US. As far as Tolstoy is concerned, that's just not Christianity. It's a fake Christianity. It's something that, now, he might not necessarily blame every sort of so-called Christian for pretending to be a Christian. He will consider that, again, there's a whole sort of history of that happening. The message of Christianity, as far as Tolstoy is concerned, got corrupted the moment Christianity was adopted as the religion of the empire by Constantine. And he's deeply anti-clerical. But then in his anti-clericalism, I'm not sure he's that wildly different from the Jesus of the gospel. So, look, one of the reasons I suppose I got intrigued by this material to begin with was that it seems to preach an ethics, a way of life, both as an individual and the kind of community that you'd imagine of individuals of the sort, that is very different from the one that you tend to see in mainstream Christianity. And it's one that's kind of really inspirational, radical, sacrificial, almost, utopian, if you want to use that term. We can discuss that too. That's an interesting term for that matter. But it's not the one that most self-proclaimed Christians adhere to. It's something they prefer to underplay, in a way Tolstoy discusses as well, and as do other Christian anarchists. And so, how would I see a kind of possible contribution, or how would a Christian anarchist kind of judge all those contexts today? They'll be more interested in the more, do you want to call them progressive Christian voices, denouncing neocolonialism, imperialism, empire, the various things that the state does. They'll be critical of nationalism and patriotism. They'll be allies on issues around discrimination, repression, injustice. They'll emphasize the enacting of the teaching of Jesus, however nuts it seems, even if it means carrying a cross, which he did warn about. And that's all very different from going to church however often you want to go and reassuring yourself that God bless whatever country you're in.
Yeah. Derek, you had a question that was similar, somewhat related to that.
Yeah, so one of the questions that I guess the one I'll pick for now is when I think of Chesterton, who I respect a lot, but he doesn't have much good to say about anarchists and such, at least the anarchists that he's thinking of. One of the things that he talks about is patriotism. And sometimes I feel like as I move towards the anarchist position that I'm kind of just really a pessimist about everything. Like, oh, you don't do this, and that's, supporting the state, and, July 4th, get rid of it. But Chesterton talks very positively about patriotism. And so he basically, he argues that the issue, it's wrong to say that you can't take a generalization and make it a specific. Like, I love all mankind, but I can also love the United States and have a special love for it, just like I have a special love for my kids over anybody else's kids. And that doesn't necessarily make it bad. So how does something like patriotism, how does anarchism speak to patriotism or group cohesion? And do you think Chesterton is right about patriotism, and can we really be a part of a nation and celebrate with that nation?
So good question again. I'm not familiar with most of Chesterton's corpus. I know he's cited, there's a couple of passages that Christian anarchists like to cite. But I hear you, and those kinds of arguments you hear through Chesterton or not. Again, I think the answer has to depend on definitions to some extent. What do you mean by patriotism? If by patriotism you mean community, then that doesn't necessarily sound bad. And I can, I can see, look, it makes, I forget the study that ultimately we only really relate with 150 or so people in our surroundings, at least at any one time. Like you don't know most of the other people who you might identify with, who might be similar to you, but live further away from your networks, geographical or otherwise. So it's fair enough to feel a love and a bond and an identity with the people, I suppose, let's say, closer to you. Whether that needs to be projected onto what is ultimately an imagined community, to use Benedict Anderson's terms, the nation, I'm not sure. So if by patriotism you mean community, then sure, loving your community or whatever you identify with, I don't necessarily think it's problematic for Christian anarchists as far as I can speak for them, and I don't know that I should, but never mind. If by that you mean valuing things not because of their intrinsic value, but because they are ours, then that sounds less promising. So, bearing in mind, and this again would be, I suppose, my analysis, but shared, I think, by at least some Christian anarchists, othering opens the road for dehumanizing. We're all different, and that's great. We're all different, but much depends on what you do with that. Whether you celebrate is too vague a term, but work with it, learn with it, enjoy it, and sometimes there'll be frictions, but differences aren't necessarily a bad thing. What patriotism tends to do is it emphasizes those differences. It focuses on our history, our common heritage, what we do, and it very quickly has a simplified version of that, and equally a simplified version of what those others do. Now, patriotism can be warm and progressive, has been historically. Patriotism in the 19th century was associated with liberal, progressive ideas. The patriotism of French nationalism in the 19th century is the patriotism of universal values, because we French people have worked it out. So immediately there's a weird association there, that kind of logic. Now, one thing that I like, to again return to Tolstoy, because he was often asked, but surely there's a good form of patriotism. He railed against it. Doesn't he think that there's good patriotism? And the question, the people who asked that typically had in mind, say, the patriotism of the Irish or the Poles or the Finnish, people who didn't have a nation yet. A nation didn't therefore have self-determination, okay, those kinds of human rights, a kind of political architecture to map onto the land that somehow is theirs or where they tend to predominate. But what Tolstoy liked to point out, and I like about what he says there, is if something's intrinsically good, it's good because it's intrinsically good, not because it's something that's believed or held by a particular people. The Irish, the Poles, the Finnish, deserve self-determination, perhaps, but they deserve that because self-determination is a good thing, not because they're Irish or Polish or Finnish. What's good about our community, about our way of life, is good because that thing is good, not because it's something that we do. It's good that this be done. So that's the type of patriotism that if you want to call it patriotism by then, that I can sympathize with, that someone like Tolstoy will have time for, but he won't call that patriotism. It's valuing the things that are good because they're good. So when you commemorate, wars, for example, the heroes, the brilliant deeds that were done by us lot against them nasty people. Well, it's the good deed that's worth celebrating, which, by the way, we weren't always full of, and the other side never do either. That's the thing you want to celebrate rather than the usness and the themness. Patriotism skews things. It kind of gives you, it narrows your view, and it ends up overly simplifying and identifying particular values with particular people. So, community, celebration of, things that are good, that have been done by, I suppose, us lot or people in our neck of the woods for a while, fine. But patriotism, when it becomes kind of something that excludes others, that associates certain values with us, as if others can't necessarily subscribe to them, or can't translate them and interpret them in ways that are different and interesting in that difference, because of a different context, then that's a patriotism that, I suppose, certainly Tolstoy or me or quite a few other Christian anarchists would be less fond of. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think that's important to note that, from what I understand, you're saying that anarchism doesn't undermine community, which I think is what a lot of people would think of anarchism. But it actually expands that community because we incorporate other, and we don't define us versus them. Absolutely, and because the way that community has been defined is not restricted to a particular identity, it's potentially open to many others, and therefore it is indeed open potentially to the human race, rather than
just a particular section of it. Absolutely.
So you mentioned, like, there's originally a lot of focus on the state, on that aspect of, like, let's say, empire. What are some of the main maybe thinkers, or the main thinking around the concept of othering and of domination and hierarchy between people? Because I don't think Tolstoy focused on that as much.
So I was about to say the thing about Tolstoy, which is again one of the reasons he's an awkward client. He uses the vocabulary of Christianity for that. You see, he thinks that, and I'm going to try and use his way of spinning it, when we all become Christians, then it'll all be peace and love and all fine, right? So his vision is that. Let me rephrase it. When he has in mind kind of that Christianity has somehow been adopted by everyone, what he's basically saying is that it's when everyone has adopted Jesus's rather radical and loving ethics of kind of caring and forgiving and love and all that stuff, loving your neighbor, being a servant to one another, and in particular foregoing any violence or any role in maintaining any machinery of violence or consenting to it. Now, that's what he considers being a Christian. So when we're all Christians, that won't happen anymore. We'll be living in a new Christian era. I'm trying to use his vocabulary here. The point about that is it's very much a contrast from nations as we currently understood them. I think the promise of Christianity for someone like Tolstoy is that it erases differences between human beings and therefore forms of othering, because it's an adoption of a way of life that is embraced in that vision by everyone, because people are inspired to do so by a few pioneering examples, kind of thing. Now, what's bizarre, or I don't know if it's bizarre, but what sometimes hinders the understanding of that message, as attempted by Tolstoy, is that he's using precisely, language that others, as in he's using the language of Christianity, which we associate with one religious tradition, as opposed to numerous others. But the way in which he uses it with that kind of universalistic kind of perspective in mind. So it's not. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. But so from that perspective, I don't know that there would not be any othering, but you would always be interested in, I suppose, encountering the other, forgiving the other if they harm you, I suppose, learning from one another, etc. And envision, again, a community in which there is no, whatever othering continues to happen doesn't happen in the way it tends to today, if that makes sense. So it's not one that enables various hierarchies of superiority. But what's awkward about it is, of course, the process to get us there still involves a community that somehow has understood that, or behaves in what Tolstoy would see as a Christian way, as opposed to others who don't yet. But those aren't treated as inferior or certainly worth any, any, what's the word I'm looking for? Any disrespect? Does that make sense? Sorry, I lost myself a bit.
Because that's one of the questions that comes up for me. Like, both anarchists and Anabaptists advocate for some kind of communalism and the strong focus on the kingdom of God. And it is, in a sense, it's against othering, because it's against what empire does to the other. But at the same time, it is forming a strong communal identity that does, as some critiques of monotheism would say, like, exclude the other, which is violence. So it's a paradox of some kind that that.
I agree, but I think it comes with. I think you're right. I think it comes with an openness to the other, which a number of other forms of identity don't embrace, if that makes sense. So there are all sorts of ways of imagining community, society, nationhood identity, that aren't necessarily interested in learning from the other, engaging with the other or with others. This is a form of identity that, yeah, absolutely still kind of identifies an us and a them, but it's an us that wants to reach out, that I guess to some extent, yeah, does want to convert or preach, but it's one that's also open to treating others with respect and forgiveness, and therefore it's also a way of approaching others that is not going to concede to any form of violence being imposed. But then you have the issue of defining violence, and of course the othering and creating identity is a form of violence. Perhaps it's still not exactly direct violence in the way that, you know, a tank does, I think.
Yeah, it does go around in a circle.
It does a bit. So yeah, I think there's a paradox there. You're right, but I don't think it's a complete incoherence or inconsistency. It's an interesting paradox.
Yeah. Actually, Derek had an interesting question about Ellul and something linked to that.
Right. Yeah, if we're gonna go on to that, we can definitely jump there. Because that was dealing more with like social justice, and I think Rebecca and I were talking through her questions and talking about abolition and how it's interesting how when you look back you see a lot of social justice before its time, before a lot of other people caught on. One of the things from your book that stuck out to me was very pertinent today, because when I got to towards the end, you talk about how Ellul was against compulsory vaccination, and I think if I remember correctly, it came in a section of the book where you're talking about social justice and concern for the other and concern for neighbors, and it's so fascinating that today we have this conversation where you have, again, the left and the right, at least in the States, where the left says, hey, we need to love people, therefore I want to force you to have a vaccination. And you have people on the other side who say, no, you can't forcefully love me. That's impossible. And they refuse to do that because they think they're standing up to tyranny, or whatever else they think. And so I was wondering if you would have any thoughts from the perspective of Christian anarchism of how you balance loving your neighbor as well as pushing back against tyranny, what that might look like in today's time.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I do mention it in the book. I was looking up that passage as you're talking. I mean, this is in the section on sort of what to do about the state according to those various voices that I've looked at in the book, and they mainly preach things like not holding public office. They have an ambivalence about paying taxes. They preach, refusing conscription and war. But then there's a section where I have to sort of be honest and mention a few other positions, and Ellul does at the time oppose compulsory vaccination or even compulsory schooling. I mean, let's leave schooling aside. I know that in France there has long been an anti-vax movement. It's quite embedded, and it's been visible with COVID, but you could see it coming even before the vaccination had been invented, the vaccine. So there's a strong anti-vaccine in France, and I suspect Ellul in many ways belongs to that. It's complicated to translate that into the language of love and caring for one another. I don't know if it's complicated, but I think it's a fair question. It seems to me, look, if I'm wearing a mask in confined spaces, I'm primarily doing it for others, not for me. First off, the mask mainly protects the people the people you're surrounded by, as in it doesn't protect the filtering in so much as the sort of, not spreading the virus if you have it asymptomatically or otherwise, actually. So it seems to me not that difficult to argue that it's not exactly a very loving and caring position not to care and therefore not wear a mask, because I want my freedom. It's very selfish, I think. I mean, I don't know where you live. We spent sometime in the summer in France with family, when England had just gone through its Freedom Day, where our dear leader had decided that it was time to sort of ditch our masks, and it was interesting. So then the language became one of encouragement. So in most sort of shops where you go into, they'll say, or trains and whatever, they've tried a way of phrasing something along the lines, we all have our freedom to decide what to do, but we encourage you to wear a mask. I mean, they've spinned it differently from one place to the next, but they're trying to encourage people to wear masks. But the majority by now don't. And so just before we left, I noticed, supermarkets, you had maybe 20% not wearing masks anymore. Now it's more like maybe 1/3 still do. And that annoys me. It annoys me because I'm thinking that's just selfish. Like you might be carrying the virus. You don't know who's vulnerable around you. You don't know who's vulnerable and not coming out anymore because they can't afford getting the virus. Now, I'm lucky enough, I've been vaccinated. My immediate family has as well. Because I chose to. I could have not done it. So vaccines, I think, is a bit more difficult because the vaccine is protecting yourself primarily, although by not getting it, hopefully you're not transmitting it. But certainly on masks, I think it's not that far-fetched to argue that it's a bit selfish to decide not to wear one. With vaccination, it's more complicated, but there is still an element of collective immunity, to use the term that they've tried to herd immunity, the term that they've avoided ever since they conceded that was basically what drove them at the very start here in the UK. The more people are protected against the virus, the less likely it is to circulate and affect others. I don't know whether I suppose in my context and with the people I talk to, it's not so much through the language of Christianity or Christian ethics that people are going to be convinced of getting vaccinated or not. It's the language of public health, and there's a number of things for which we rely on to call it one word, the science. When I walk on a bridge, I trust that the engineers and the science that backs them up have built it properly. Same when I go in a plane. With medicine, I'm not an expert, but I gather that the evidence is accumulating that, frankly, it's a better idea to get vaccinated for yourself as well as for others than not. And it's on that basis that I went for it. At the very start, I think like many others, I was interested to see what the studies might say, because you don't know what's in this vaccine, new technology, side effects, and there are, it turns out, some side effects, but they're very rare, and not getting vaccinated makes you much worse on those very side effects, etc. So I think it's more on the public health argument that I try and speak to the people I speak to and to encourage them to get vaccinated, rather than through the language of Christianity. But that's not to say you can't do it. I think it's a longer road there, I suspect. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so we're towards the end of the interview now. I guess one last question that I would have is, in terms of people who aren't necessarily into theology or into academics, what are some ways that they can tap into Christian anarchism? What some gateway resources or that you would recommend, or thinkers, writers, that kind of thing?
It kind of depends on what you prefer. If you're quite keen on a version of Christianity that is not Tolstoyan, more typically Protestant, there's all sorts of varieties, then you might be more interested in Ellul, Eller, Andrews. If there we go, my pen's gone. If you can cope with a Tolstoyan kind of Christianity, and what you're interested in is the broader kind of critique of violence, non-violence, and then Tolstoy is definitely a great read. And for that matter, you can read Tolstoy even if you are of a different type of Christianity than him, and still focus on what he has to say on the Christian ethics in particular, and kind of roll your eyes if you want to on the other stuff. But it's still a challenge, I think, to sort of read it, and because it makes you rethink what you're doing. But then in the States, of course, in particular, there's a lot of Catholic worker communities doing all sorts of work in cities in particular, caring, what's their expression? Caring for the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Helping people like, people, refugees struggling with the Kafkaesque paperwork, encouraging them to go away, providing food for them, performing acts of liturgy, to use their vocabulary sometimes, on Ministry of Defense buildings and whatnot. There's all sorts of things that you can do there and get embedded in your local community, not just in the US, but in particular in the US with Catholic workers. And then of course online, there's plenty. There's like loads of different things, whether it's Facebook groups, although some are getting colonized by different perspectives, let's say, or all sorts of interesting podcasts. I mean, there's lots out there, and I can't really speak for it because there's really a lot going on, and it is heavily sort of American focused. A lot of people are from North America in those communities, but that's not a problem. That's just something I notice is part of it. But that also means that you get the kind of activities and debates that you will typically get in North America, I think. So and I suspect that there's a fair bit of talking about American politics in some of these fora too. So it depends what you're interested in. There's lots of books and resources. A lot of the longer books, even a lot of what Tolstoy wrote, is available for free online, sort of if you know where to look. But you can Google around, try with PDF in your searches, you'll find it. And by the way, on Tolstoy, I should say, not to forget it, it's a guy called Steve Heike, I think is how you just spell his name or describe it. He did a PhD on Tolstoy at Aberdeen, which I was lucky enough to be an external examiner for, but he actually takes a rather different approach to me on Tolstoy. He reckons it is high time that we read Tolstoy as Christians, because he speaks to Christians in a way that's much less incompatible than I say read it, for example. So he brings Tolstoy to the Protestant tradition, or makes him a bit more, I don't know if he makes him more comfortable, but makes the case that he should be considered as an important thinker in the Christian story, as it were. So yeah, it kind of depends what you're interested in. And I guess, last thing, one chapter that I co-wrote with someone called Lara Abs in Canada. It's been published in 3 different versions now, but at least 2 of these I think are available for free online. But it's a chapter that tries to map out the literature on anarchism and religion, kind of in 4 categories: kind of anarchist critiques of religion, anarchist exegesis, anarchist theology, and anarchist historiography. So writing the histories of Christian religious anarchist individuals and communities. And that particular piece, if you Google it and find it, there's lots of references to all sorts of sources. So I'm not saying read that. I'm saying jump to the bibliography, or read the bits that you're more interested in, and pick that up and follow that trail, kind of thing. Might be another way of recommending things.
Great. Thanks for joining us and giving us an overview of the discourses in Christian anarchism, something our audience may be less familiar with and not sure where to get into. So that's a great start. And thanks for giving us an idea of the vast complexity of the current scholastic debate on it, how it's categorized and what it focuses on, and what it is, which in scholarly works is always up for debate. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Alex, and
You're very
thanks,
welcome.
Derek.
My pleasure.
Thanks, and thanks, Derek, for kind of co-hosting.